Presence, the podcast for everyone interested in bodywork, embodiment, and somatic practices. I'm Andrew Rosenstock, your host and guide on this enlightening journey. With my expertise as a somatic movement therapist, yoga therapist, and certified rolfer, I'll merge clinical insight with real-world experience to enrich our discussions with our guests. Through engaging and informative talks, this podcast delves into mind-body paradigms, offering insights and strategies to empower personal growth. Your support is vital for our grassroots and lo-fi production. If you connect with our content, please leave a positive review and subscribe on your preferred platform. Your engagement helps us reach a broader audience and supports our mission. So thanks for tuning in today to Touching into Presence. Fasten your seatbelt as we embark on a journey to explore the transformative power of contemplative and somatic practices together. It was a pleasure to be in conversation today with Bonnie Gintis, DO. Bonnie has taught worldwide, addressing physicians and all people interested in exploring embodiment. She retired from osteopathic private practice in 2009 and now devotes herself to teaching, writing, and exploring new ways to foster health and well-being. She is the author of Engaging the Movement of Life, Exploring Health and Embodiment Through Osteopathy and Continuum. She is a 1986 graduate of the New York College of Osteopathic Medicine, where she also taught Osteopathic Principles and Practice. She's been a faculty member with the Sutherland Cranial Teaching Foundation, the American Academy of Osteopathy, the European School of Osteopathy, the German Academy for Osteopathic Medicine, and Jim Jealous DO. Bonnie's been a board member, faculty member, and course director for the Osteopathic Cranial Academy, and was honored with the fellowship in the Osteopathic Cranial Academy in 2015. Bonnie studied Continuum exclusively with Emily Conrad and taught in collaboration with her from 1997 till the time of her death in 2014. She was authorized by Emily to teach Continuum and now teaches a synthesis of all areas of her exploration and expertise. She's had more than 50 years of meditation practice, trained to be a teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and has explored many approaches to mindfulness within and outside of Buddhist traditions. Bonnie's innovative approach combines osteopathy, Continuum's fluid movement exploration, and mindfulness, expanding the possibilities for experiencing health and embodiment, and allowing for the development of perceptual skills to more deeply care for ourselves and others. In today's talk, we discussed about what osteopathy and Continuum are. We shared perspective on the importance of natural movement, meditation, and a holistic approach in professional practices. We also discussed ways to connect with Bonnie's work, including her wonderful book and her upcoming teaching schedule, including a retreat at Kripalu in October. There was really so much territory we could cover, and I felt Bonnie did a great job to just scratch the surface without opening up too many wormholes to go down, as the topics are rather vast topics as we explore them more. I would highly recommend her book and her podcast to get a deeper sense into what osteopathy and Continuum can be. They are practices which I personally still so green about, but have been touched and changed by them in profound ways. I hope, if they can be supportive for you, that you too can get more information to explore your inner workings through these ways of being. If it wasn't too obvious when listening to this talk, I'm really a big fan of Bonnie and was delighted not to just be in conversation with her, but to also share her out with you all. So enough of me. Let's listen to Bonnie now. You have two things in particular that I'm really excited to showcase because I think that they're very important and not as well known, and so I'm excited about that.
What are those two things? So,
yeah, I mean, osteopathy and Continuum.
Oh, well, that's me.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's my whole life. So, yeah.
Yeah, without saying it too much, I'm really grateful for your time to be here. I'm really grateful to be in conversation. I loved reading your book. I've been loved listening to your podcast, and I enjoyed our pre-call, and I'm really excited to share you more because you're one of those people who when I found, I thought, wow, this person has so much knowledge and experience and stuff to share that I want to help share that because I find it just an access to health. And I think that's what's really a lot of people are missing or looking for is an access to health. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this talk goes and what either gets shared today or what sparks an interest that people follow up. And they follow up. There's so many ways which I'll share at the end, but there is There is your book, there is your podcast. You also do have a workshop coming up in October in Kripalu, which will have all that. So there's information, but let's actually talk about that instead of just talk about the talking about.
Right, right.
Yeah. As I mentioned to you, there's many things, but there's two things I'm so jazzed about. You can even hear it maybe in my voice. My nervous system is like, ah. Um, and that's both Continuum as a separate entity, osteopathy as a separate entity, and then for you the cross or the merging or the blending, or maybe the non-dualness of them.
Mm-hmm.
Where in that would Bonnie want to start?
I think the best way to tell that story is through my own experience, how
Yeah.
I came upon all of this. I started osteopathic training in 1981. I had a dear friend, his name is also Andrew, who was a bit of a workshop junkie. And uh, he came over my house every week. He loved to come over on Wednesday nights because on Wednesday was the big day where we had our osteopathic hands-on training. And I would always practice on him what we had learned each week. So one week he came over and he had just come back from a workshop and he said to me, I just spent 5 days with this woman and she taught us how to do what it feels like you're doing with me when you work on me osteopathically. And the workshop was with Emily Conrad, and it was his first Continuum workshop. And I made note of that. I thought that was interesting. I put it in the back of my mind and forgot about it. And as the first year of my training went on, I started feeling like it was somewhat insane that they were teaching me how to feel things in other people's bodies when I had never even considered feeling those things in my own body. So to discover that a phenomenon exists in the living human body and to like bypass my own and just go to somebody else just seemed far removed from my own source of wisdom. Perhaps at the time I was only 25. I didn't think of my body as a source of wisdom yet, but I was on to something, and it felt important. So I remembered what my friend Andrew had said, and I started looking around for this, what is this continuum? Is it still around? And every few years, I kept stumbling upon somebody who was involved in Continuum who said, when you speak about osteopathy, it sounds like Continuum. And then after I've spent time with you and I go to a Continuum workshop, it sounds like osteopathy. And I realized that there are really foundational concepts in both Continuum and osteopathy. In Continuum, you learn how to apply them to yourself and see the world through that lens, through your own embodiment. And in osteopathy, you learn how to apply those same principles to someone else's body. And if I had to pinpoint a particular foundational concept, I would say that it's about movement. That if the body were free to move and occupy space the way it needed to, that it would take care of itself.
Yeah.
What I feel like made my osteopathic training somewhat different than some other people's is that my earliest teachers really appreciated that idea of the movement of the body as the primary mover of the therapeutic process. And that the role of the osteopath was to create the conditions for everything in the body to be able to move. And the way I was taught all anatomy, physiology, and pathology was through the lens of movement. What is a sinus infection? It's a lack of movement of mucus. What is depression? It's a lack of movement of emotions. What is pneumonia? It's a lack of movement of fluid and air in the lungs. Everything in the body can be looked at through the lens of movement. And then as an osteopath, we're not moving things around. We're not like pounding down high spots or putting things in some mythical place they're supposed to be. We're creating the conditions for movement. And if the body were free to move, all of these things would happen on their own. So much of what's necessary in most therapeutic situations in the body is inflow of nutrients and outflow of waste products, space for reorganization, space for, white blood cells and things that help with tissue remodeling to come in. And if there are injuries or waste products from a disease, an infection, an injury, whatever, those things need to be processed and carried away. So I feel like the way that I was trained in osteopathy opened my mind to being with my own body in a different way. And I would ask my teachers in osteopathic school, and they didn't even understand the question. It just wasn't in the culture of the time. So I discovered Continuum, and it was almost like the B theme of my education. I would go home at night and I would lie down on the floor or lie down in bed, and everything that I learned that day, I would do like my own little body scan or my own little exploration through my own body. It's like, can I actually sense that? Can I I know this is happening. Can I feel the movement of my liver as I'm breathing and my diaphragm is moving up and down? I started with simple, more mechanical things, but I spent a good part of my education just meditating on my own perceptual field. And the practice of Continuum completely supported me doing that.
There's a part of me that says, all right, I think we have enough for today. There's so much already in that.
Well, this is the basis of a good deal of my work, both with people wanting to be with their own body and people learning how to work with other people's bodies. But there's one other really important piece in my education that I want to add to that. I'm always interested in the history of whatever it is I'm involved in. And the founder of osteopathy was Andrew Taylor Still, and he lived in the 1800s in what was at the time was the frontier of the United States. It was the Kansas, Missouri area. And as a child, he had very bad headaches, chronic headaches. And I think anyone who's had a headache knows that feeling of just feeling compressed. Like if somebody could just give me some space between my occiput and my neck, something could breathe and I'd feel better. A lot of people do their own massage or try to create traction or something to create space there. So he was walking through a field where they had his father had strung up string rope as a plow line, to plow in a straight line. And he saw that rope and he had an idea. And he grabbed the rope and he threw it over a branch of a tree and he put a towel on it and he laid down on it. And he ended up falling asleep with his neck basically in a sling over this rope suspended from a tree. And when he woke up, his headache was gone. So he was only 12. He didn't know exactly what happened, but he talked about having this visceral sense in his own body that he changed the structure of his body and he felt differently. The function changed. So he carried this idea throughout his whole life that there's a relationship between the structure and the function of the body. And it took him another 50 years to flesh out that idea and come up with his approach using a hands-on form of manipulation to offer that to other people. But it interested me that in some ways the root of the profession began in his own experience. And then the other influential person in the development of osteopathy was William Sutherland. Anyone who's involved in any branch of cranial anything pretty much owes it to William Sutherland, who was the first person in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who looked at the shapes of the bones in the skull and said, why would they be so elaborately shaped if they weren't designed to move? Everyone thought he was crazy when he started talking about that, and he decided to be somewhat of an open-minded skeptic himself. And he created all of these devices. He would take a baseball mitt and he would wrap his head with bandages. And he thought, if there really is movement there, if I inhibit the movement, I'll notice something change. He actually almost died doing it. There were a few experiments he did where he lost consciousness. His wife luckily found him and unwrapped his head. But he proved to himself from his own experience that if he limited the motion of his cranium, that it was not compatible with life. So I thought this was interesting that two people who were so influential in the development of the profession began with themselves. And yet here I was in 1981 with nobody wanting to talk about what was happening in our own bodies. So I thought, okay, I guess I just have to explore this one on my own. So I did so in many, many ways. And I give Continuum credit because I feel like in the long run, that was the container that really nurtured my educational explorations the most. But I found it just incredibly fruitful to go there, and then to blend the two, both with how I taught other osteopaths and taught people Continuum, or taught my patients how to take care of themselves in the years when I was in private practice.
Yeah, and today, the client I just saw earlier today, a lot of the session was about, I can do manual work on you, but why don't you find ways to work so that, move so that you can actually feel or take a little bit more agency in this, or become aware of. For him, he's got a very interesting scoliotic pattern, and teaching him like how to move in a certain way on one side, how it feels different on the other, and even just starting to notice where the restrictions come. He's so grateful for it, because the other manual manipulative people, the PTs and the massage people, they just do to him, and then he goes out. And it's like,
Right.
How does he actually get the internal experience and the awareness so that he can actually start to take more control?
Right. On some level, people come to you or to any other hands-on practitioner of any variety. Their whole life led up to the moment where they come to you. You spend an hour with them, and they go live the rest of their life. Something else has to change other than your treatment for them to really be able to integrate that change. Once in a while, people have a key restriction that is so bound up, and the moment the light shines on it, everything changes and unfolds from there. But really, the vast majority of what most people do with other people involves, the body learning a new way of being with itself.
Yeah, very
And
much so.
yeah, and you can do great work in 30 to 60 minutes with somebody, and then they need to go home and make it their own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm interested a bit about something you said, and maybe to get more information on it, which is you say osteopathy is all about movement. And then as I'm hearing it, yet there wasn't necessarily movement practices for osteopaths. And you found Continuum, and I'm sure other osteopaths have found others. Has there become some sort of movement that is like when people are studying osteopathy now, do they learn movement as well, or is it?
No, it has this hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
I had hoped to be the one to integrate it. And there have been years when I've been teaching where people who've studied with me have gotten that, but it has not become part of, the osteopathic canon of offerings. And I think most osteopaths still think that, they're the ones that are moving the other person's body, that are helping to create the therapeutic effect. And they're not thinking about how people need to be with their own body.
Yeah, or they're not necessarily even being with their own body. It's so,
Right, right.
yeah. I mean, I think you and I are somewhat drinking the same drink, so of course we might have a similar view,
Yeah.
but the real sense of it, like you were saying, you've learned all these things, and this is not just in osteopathy, but in many. I see it a lot in the rolfing world and even in cranial sacral, and especially in yoga, the bypass of I want to
Yeah.
do this to others, partly so I don't even have to look at my own stuff.
Mm.
And I know in my own process that was incredibly transformative of when the shift happened and it was more about working on me. And then as I continue to work more on me, I've become a lot better practitioner, you know?
Yeah, I think it clears your perceptual field when you're more open and there are fewer inhibitors that are distorting what you're sensing from others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How I don't know what it would call for me. There's a part of me that just is like, but this seems so much like the answer. That might just be the Dunning-Kruger effect happening in my own
Uh-huh.
world. But like, how would you see, or how have you tried to get that out there? Because it, without beating the dead horse, it seems so obvious at this point that that's a pretty key part for any osteopath, any body worker, um,
Hmm.
any talk therapist to have that. And I mean, being that osteopathy is so much about movement, that movement practice and movement being either a external movement or an internal, your self guidance experientials or
Hmm.
movement as well. How do you see getting that out there? How do you see bringing that in more?
Well, the way that I've done it in my life so far has been through teaching in both institutions and organizations. I spent about 12 years teaching part-time in an osteopathic school, and I always integrated experiential practices in the classes that I taught. More formally, as the years went on, I certainly couldn't do it when I was working in an institution. But when
Mhm.
I started teaching in organizations, and mostly in the United States through the osteopathic organization called the Cranial Academy, uh, or the Sutherland Cranial Teaching Foundation, a little less so because they're a little bit more set in their curriculum. I started integrating continuum practices into how I taught osteopathy. And there was enough interest for a period of years where I used to teach classes where we would spend half the day doing continuum. People would be working and moving with themselves. And then in the afternoon, we would go to the tables and people would work in pairs and we would do some sort of osteopathic exploration, having just explored the same topic in ourselves. And those were, I loved them. It was fabulous. They were popular with a small group of people. And I had much more interest in the work that I was doing in other countries, uh, primarily in Germany. In the years when I was teaching the most, I went several times a year to Germany, um, in England and France, Netherlands, Belgium, Canada.
Yeah. Uh,
All problems in osteopathy in the United States come back to the restrictions of being part of the mainstream of
mhm.
medical education. So I knew it just wasn't going to happen in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even as you're like before you even brought it to that, I wrote a note saying doctors too rigid to type
Right,
right and to
right.
think and thinking like, wow, what would it be like to bring in a bit more self introspection and just movement and for clarification for those listeners who I might offend, no, not every doctor is too rigid. This is a right a gross saying, but that's doctors are generally known for having a curt, not having a good bedside manner, and for being very sharp to the point, which has a value. Um,
It's more foundational than that. I mean,
mhm,
when I think just being restricted by the profound amount of information
Mhm.
have to you have to gather and integrate in 4 years of education in the United States.
Mhm.
It's nearly impossible to add
Mhm.
one more thing. So I felt like the best that I could do was just make it available for people who were either in school or finishing school who wanted to explore this further. And I mean, that's who have been my following for the
Yeah.
past 20, 30 years, that group of people. And in addition to me, it's not just me and Continuum. There are osteopaths who are involved in um, Qigong practice
Mhm.
and other movement practices where they've tried to integrate this into education.
Yeah. Yeah. Qigong I've seen implemented more in cranial sacral. There's a lot of people, especially the biodynamics, who are integrating
Mm-hmm.
Qigong, which I see. And I do think with what little I do know about Continuum, that Qigong can be done, same with yoga, can be done at a very cerebral default mode network way.
Right.
Pointing to this other place, and my understanding of Continuum is Continuum really helps to get to that non-cortical, more subcortical, unfolding embryonic movement. That sort of not being a way of thinking about the movement, but letting the movement move you.
Yeah, yes. And that can exist in all of
Yes.
these other things, or you can be trapped in form. I mean, our culture is so trapped in the form of everything. I mean, I can barely tolerate going to most yoga classes because it feels like they're like so attached to the form and
Yes.
they've lost the life force that's moving the form or the
Mm-hmm.
breath that's moving. I mean, I like to pour into and out of an asana and
Mm-hmm.
not worry so much about perfecting the form when I'm in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's um, so there,
Same. Same. Yeah.
and over the years, I've had all sorts of people with different movement backgrounds come to classes of mine, and one of the most interesting ones was a man. He was a Bagua master,
Mm.
and he came to Continuum, and he said, what you're teaching us in the first hour that we're together is what my teacher said we could do after 10 years of practice.
Mm-hmm.
Like we weren't allowed to follow our own chi until we had been
Mm.
doing it for 10 years. And I said, well, what does a baby do when they're born? They're just, they're just on the ground moving. They're following their own life force and they're just moving the way they're moved to do so.
Mm-hmm.
It's our birthright. We start out that way. It shouldn't have to be something that you study and earn.
Mm-hmm.
We literally need to remember it.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. As you know, my wife is currently pregnant, and so at night we feel the baby kicking, and it's not thinking I need to do this or that.
No.
It's just unfolding
Right.
and
It has an impulse and it follows
yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And uh, if you, every time I wonder about something, I go back historically. So I'll look developmentally or embryologically. How did this unfold? So if you think about what happens after conception, we're 99 point some odd percent water and
Mm,
everything is moving. I mean, life is developing and growing in a moving fluid environment. Movement is happening. It's all of what we are is
mm,
movement at that point. Way down the road, we develop a nervous system. And in the development of our nervous system, the sensory system develops first. And the motor system grows in on the pathway that were laid down by the sensory system. So people think about how, like, having an authentic impulse to move, and they somehow feel like they need to create some kind of an impulse and make it happen. No, movement is what was going on all around when the organism didn't know the difference between itself and its environment. Everything was moving in concert with each other. And in continuum practice, we're always looking to get back to what we consider um, uh, we call it the lowest order. I mean, not like there's a hierarchy, but like historically the oldest order of experience.
mm.
So there's a silent felt experience. And it's not always just movement, but movement is a huge part of it. That's the foundational language that the body uses to communicate both with itself and with others. And if you can get back to the place where you experience that before you've labeled it and interpreted it and judged it and drawn conclusions from it, something else can happen.
Yeah.
So when you talk about whatever you called it, the pre-cortical state of movement, yeah, a large part of continuum practice is about slowing down and backing up and trying to come into that first order experience the movement of life in your body. That's why I named my book Engaging the Movement of Life. It's how do we tap into that without too much thinking? And not that there's anything wrong with thinking. We're humans. We think. It's
time. It's time and place. There's a time and a place for both.
Right, and it has its light and its dark side. And
yeah, I sometimes say, like, when clients get to that space and say, "This is great," I say, "It is, but you can't drive your car at this place. you can't do these other things than that."
Right. When you're in the airport in Boston and you're about to miss your plane, it's not time for creative wave motion. It's time to biomechanically use the most efficient way to run to the gate.
Yeah, and then make sure afterwards there's a dissipation period to say, okay, I needed to mobilize. I needed to get this all up there. I can breathe now, and I can shake it out and whatnot. Not that an airplane is the best place for that, but it's okay.
No, but those of us who know that it's valuable to do that, we'll do it. We'll find some quiet space in the even in the bathroom in the airport, to just have a moment to ourselves.
Yeah. So I do want to go to your book, but there's something you said in that I want to ask, which is, so that this place of, so the continuum can offer to be into that place of not really a thinking, but a feeling, being state. Is that, when you, as an osteopath, is that what you are sensing into when you're working with people? Or is that in the mix in some way?
I think it's one of many portals of perception that a person could take. It's not necessarily a goal, but I think a lot of what we tap into in the body is the developmental forces that are still expressing themselves as healing forces in adults. And perhaps that's where the potency of the therapeutic process gets excited and sparked and triggered. Not all osteopaths think that way or think that way all the time.
Would you say, though, in your experience, maybe the ones who, like, so I know that the Cranial Academy that you mentioned is based more out of Sutherland's work, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, like, so, or sometimes called cranial in the osteopathic field, or do I have it backwards?
Osteopathy in the cranial
field. I always mix that up. Would you say that the ones who are more into that side of cranial are more into, into that side of osteopathy, are more into what you're talking about just now?
It's actually hard to say. There was a time where I might have said yes, but as I see it, there's a spectrum, and at one end, and so I used to think of this as a linear thing. At one end of the spectrum, there was biomechanics, and you can be biomechanical with the cranium. You can be as biomechanical with the cranium as you are with the spine or the knee or anything else in the body that's you're looking at materialistically and biomechanically. And then there's a huge array of approaches in between. And at the far end is what I call the non-material approaches. So you might think of the biodynamic approach as like the least mechanical, least material of all the approaches. And there's a lot in between. I used to think of it as a linear progression. And I think it only is because it's easier to learn it that way. Our culture is so mechanistic and so materialistic that it's just easier to, start with the things you can put your fingers on and move. And it's harder to understand the abstractions of working with things that are not measurable or of the material world. But I don't think that there's a hierarchy of importance or finesse in being at one end of the spectrum or the other. So I've actually started to think about it as a series of overlapping circles. And to me, in my if I'm in my identity as an osteopath, I'm concerned about where the necessity of the patient lies. If someone comes into my office and their foot hurts, and they've been going for acupuncture or they've had some homeopathic remedies, their foot's not feeling better, they're coming for osteopathy, and I examine their foot and I have a feeling they have a fracture in a metatarsal, I'm going to send them for an x-ray, and I might feel like the need to treat their fracture is more important in the moment than anything else that I can do. Now, of course, there's a lot that I can do to support that healing process. But if their primary need is in the mechanical realm, I might need to do something mechanical with them. And it doesn't mean that it's, less nuanced or less important than doing another kind of treatment that might be more oriented towards other processes. And I don't think that one exists without the other. I think there's only one thing. There's only wholeness and connectedness. I mean, connected oneness is a concept that comes up in osteopathy over and over again. So when you're being mechanical with somebody, you're appreciating the movement of the tide. One doesn't preclude the other. So when you ask me if this group of people is more in touch with a set of principles, maybe, maybe not. I know a lot of very mechanistic cranial people, and I know a lot of very subtly nuanced people who on the surface look like they're doing something biomechanical. So I think it's not about the technique. I think it's really about the underlying perceptual world of the person who's offering the treatment and where they're willing and able to meet it in other people.
Yeah, I think that's a good refinement and distinguishment in that. One thing I would say in my experience, and please correct me if incorrect, I agree with everything you say, but big but, I think for people, I was more mechanistic and denied the less material until it fell on me or until I experienced it. And then it was impossible to separate.
Right.
So I think the people who, in my experience, the people who have experienced both would agree that they're all one and the same. But the people who haven't or who can't get their head around it, who are it's only mechanistic, in their view, it is only mechanistic. And then you're, in my view, would say, well, because we've experienced this other non-mechanistic, non-material. I don't want to say it's non-mechanistic. To me, the tide still has a there's a quote unquote start and end, and at least that's how we define it. It still has a process to it.
Right.
It's just less of the hands-on, maybe in a way, or less of what we can do to the person, and more of how does this process unfold in its own sort of way, and we're just sort of observers or something like that. That's yeah.
This is really complex territory.
It is.
And there are also people at the other end of the spectrum who feel like anyone who does anything biomechanical ever is somehow lesser than.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
And and one of my biggest concerns are people who've become so enamored with a biodynamic approach that they don't notice when somebody needs something else. I've taken care of a lot of people who came to me after being treated by whether it was an osteopath or a non-osteopath who practiced some variation of osteopathic approach, where there was a physical need that wasn't noticed and addressed. And I don't expect everybody to be able to diagnose and treat everything, but to be able to recognize when the person's not responding to what you're doing, and that they need to see somebody who's going to look at what's going on in their life from a different angle. That's my biggest concern.
I again concretely in my biodynamic training, it really irked me that people would say only do you only do biodynamic, and I remember thinking, well, if you're really doing biodynamic, you could do biomechanic, and that would still be you would be listening to,
Right.
and it made no sense to me. But they were
Right.
so tied up into what I would say is their identity or their understanding. So
Right.
again, yeah.
That's where I threw out my idea that it was a linear progression from one to the other. These are overlapping circles, and they
Yeah.
all exist simultaneously. And your attention is drawn to where someone's body is asking for support.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter what you call it if you're if you're open to the to all of the different forces that are expressing themselves, and just find a way to support the body and getting what it needs to move forth with its life, with its therapeutic process, as if there's a difference between life and the therapeutic process. So.
Yeah, I feel bad for the listeners because I think we agreed to. I'm like, oh yeah, I agree.
Oh.
We want friction when we're listening. Oh, this, but no, it
Oh.
makes yeah, and it's nice for
Well,
me to
I
hear.
guarantee there are people who listening to this who, on one level, they agree with both of us, but inside of themselves, they're still trying to work out what all of this stuff means,
Hmm.
because we all live in a very mechanistic culture.
Hmm.
And those of us who are curious and who have gone kind of out of the mainstream and are willing to look at things a different way, it's there's an important struggle that we all have to go through to break through the cultural expectation that we do things a certain way.
Yeah, and I think something that we have in common that we haven't talked about yet, but that helped me out a lot with getting out of the mechanistic programming was meditation, and I know that
Mm-hmm.
meditation is a big part of who you are and what you do.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was a part for you that was helpful too.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know that my ability to pay attention as an osteopath would be what it is if I hadn't had a meditation background.
Yeah, I think we talked about this in our pre-call, but when you kind of mentioned about before about the overlaps between osteopathy and continuum, where does one begin and where does one end? And that's one of the things that happens when people come and see me, and I have a lot of different certifications and say, well, what's the difference with this or this? And I sort of say, well, for me, they're all really based out of a meditative state first, a place of non-dual beingness, just,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're building on from there in some sort of, again, some label, but it's really all about how can we, for me, if I'm in a client or even someone on the podcast, it's a little different because of how my attention needs to be, but how do I hold space together and let whatever is there show up, and then we dance around that. And meditation has been just a really wonderful enhancer and eye opener and space holder for that.
Right. Whether it's sitting with yourself or
Mm-hmm.
sitting with another person, I think it's helpful to have the ability to hold the space and not fill it with content
Mm-hmm.
and see what shows up.
Mm-hmm.
And even when something shows up, to then not jump on it immediately and draw a conclusion about it, because a lot of times what shows up is a decoy.
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and I don't think people who haven't sat for long periods of time and really gotten curious about the internal workings of their mind get what that is, and how important it is to recognize that and learn how to be patient and wait some more, as
Mm-hmm.
my teacher Ann Wales used to say all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's that for me. What's hard in the podcast role is sort of the host is there's maybe not, maybe I just haven't found how to do it yet, but there's a little bit more action that I need to do, and sort of how do I moderate, and how do we adjust to the next sort of place. But maybe I'll find a way to.
I think you're in it. I don't know that there's anything to find. I think it's okay to be curious and ask questions and say, let's go down this road. And it's like,
Well,
okay, now we've been
it
down that road, let's go down this one.
it's less about that from my own experience, and this might be boring for some, but maybe not. When I'm with clients, there's a way that I'm able to hold a different space that I haven't figured out how to do in this medium. Partly, yeah, I just haven't quite figured it out. Partly because I think I'm not just it's not just about me and you, but thinking about
Right. The
this other dimension.
context is so much bigger that
Yeah.
you by definition you hold the space differently, because there are a lot of people in the context.
Well, and there's another part which I've noticed, and is like talking with you, I would want to just, I'd love to have a cup of coffee for 5 days. There's
I'm
so
sure
much.
we could do that.
There's
come
so
come to Kripalu.
yeah, come to Kripalu in October. Unfortunately, that's when my
Yeah,
wife will be
your
giving
wife is
birth, as we
due.
talked
Right.
about. But because of that, my nervous system gets amped up, and I'll work and figure out how do I do that. That's part of the process of that.
Excitement is good. I mean, excitement is part of the life force,
It
showing
is.
you where it wants to go. So I don't know that
It
you
is.
always need to dampen that.
No, I don't need to dampen it. I need to find the way of how do I not get pulled into it. So how do I get excitement but still keep
Mm-hmm.
this? And what happens is, and I've also learned to not have coffee too close before the call, because I listened to some of the previous podcasts, and it's like, whoa, there was a lot of, and I can
Mm-hmm.
hear, I don't hear myself on my sitting bones. I hear myself up in my
Mm-hmm.
clavicles,
Right.
and that's also helpful is when I do get in calls, right, and so here I am right now, and I can say, wait a minute. So I can still be excited, but take a moment to come down.
Mm-hmm.
And that also allows the space to be entirely different, as I'm guessing you can
Yeah.
perceive. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So let's switch course for a second,
Okay.
and say, so one of the reasons I decided to not actually go so much into osteopathy is I realized you have an amazing podcast that goes all about that. So
Mm-hmm.
let's just have people listen to that. We'll put a link into it, but you can share a little bit about that. And then I want to talk about your book, because that also has loads of information for people to find out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I My husband, who's also an osteopath, his name is Steve Paulus. We work with students from time to time, and one of the last students we did a lot of intensive work with said, "Oh my God, the two of you say things in such an understandable way, and nobody talks this way. You need to find a better way to disseminate this information." And being a writer, I can think of myself as a writer. I said, well, should we spend time and write a book? And she said, oh, no, nobody reads books anymore. But if you make a podcast, everyone will listen. So we thought, okay, why not? We love to talk. Let's make a podcast. So the two of us gathered a lot of the way we think about osteopathy. And it's like, how can we present this in a way uh, where we can just talk about it and share it with people. So so that it's helpful for both our patients, our students, for people who are in training, or people who are studying anything where there are similar foundational concepts. So we're not trying to share osteopathy to make everybody an osteopath, but I think to me, osteopathy is like a way of viewing the world for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the world would be a better place if other people shared this worldview where the reference point is in health and not always in what's wrong with this situation. So it was out of that the podcast was born.
Yeah, and one of the things I did enjoy your book a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but one of the things I really enjoy about the podcast is to hear you and Steve. And so when I read the book, I
Mm-hmm.
read you, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
hear you. I don't get the subtle nuances. And when
Mm-hmm.
I hear you both speaking, and I hear the context, and I hear the embodiment, and I hear the personal stories, I don't like it's like a Netflix show. I'm waiting for the next one to just, stream over, because it's rich. And then at the same point, it's sometimes I need to stop and just
Mm-hmm.
digest three sentences you said, or even a few words. There's so much in it that writing is great. And I love reading. I'm always reading,
Right. They're
but
both wonderful.
they're both wonderful. And I'm so glad that you have done the podcast, because it also, it let me meet you in a different way. And I really enjoyed that. Really
Mm-hmm.
enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I was earlier today editing the next episode. So, and we have lots. We have a lot more planned, and it's been wonderful. Unlike a book, like when I
Mhm.
wrote my book, I knew exactly what was going to be in it, what needed to be in it, and what I was moving towards. The podcast, we started with like three ideas, and it's just like, oh, what feels like should come next,
Mhm.
and it's partly it's unfolded out of our own curiosity, and a lot of how each episode comes about is from the people who call or write to us with questions. It's
Mhm.
like, oh well, we need to do an episode on that. So uh, so in some ways it feels like it could be endless because there's just so much people write to us and ask us to speak about. So
It's also nice that there's two of you
yeah.
who have
Oh, and we're
similar,
so different.
yeah, there's similarities and there's a lot of differences. And so there
Mhm.
gets a slight different way, in a very loving and supportive way, which
Uh-huh.
is awesome to hear.
Right. And we do think of it as our child since we didn't have one together, a
Mhm.
human one. So this podcast is our baby.
Mhm.
And if the time and energy in my life unfolds the way I would like it to in the next year or two, I hope to have an audio version of my book.
Mhm.
And
That'd
I
be
have a
great.
few extra. Well, right now there are two chapters that would be added to it. So we'll see. I'm still working on it and figuring out the best platform to package it and get it out to
Mhm.
the world. But so you might be able to hear me speak my book.
Mhm. Well, talk a little bit about that, because I know I've written a book, as we've mentioned. Was that a similar sort of trajectory as the podcast? Wanting to share something? What was the?
You know, for years in my osteopathic courses, mostly, people would come up to me and they would say, "You have such a unique approach," or "That was so interesting. Where can I read more about it?" And I would jokingly say, "Well, you can't because I haven't written the book yet." And I don't know that there's anything I say that's original, completely original, but I think the way I weave together many different concepts is what's original about my work. So at a certain point in my teaching, I felt like it would support the people coming to courses if they could read a little something. So I just, one chapter at a time, just started putting together the major topics that would be in courses that I was teaching. And the book was meant to be supplementary materials for people taking a course. If I knew in 2007 when the book was published what I know today, I would have done it a little differently. Um, but I had no idea who was going to be interested in it, that there would be so much interest and so much interest outside of the osteopathic community. And even though I was already teaching some synthesis of continuum and osteopathy, I hadn't interwoven it as gracefully as I think it's turned out to be. So, um, so the book feels almost to me like it's caught in time a bit, and I would like to update it. So that's why I have this idea that well, a good part of the book I have rewritten, and the publisher doesn't want to do the audiobook. They've given me the rights to publish my own audiobook. So that's what I'm pondering right now. Exactly how to finish this job.
Well, you mentioned something, because a lot of my clients will say, "Oh, you've got similar ideas. You should write something." And writing is a struggle for me, which is why one reason I started a podcast. But another reason I struggled is caught in time. I mean, that was something I think.
Yeah.
How much do I say now that in 5 years from now I might say, "Oh, not exactly that," and having to get over that. Yeah.
Every writer goes through that, and I have to say 90% of my book I feel really good about.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of it that needed changing. There's only one thing that's like it's kind of an error. It's really minor. Mm. There's one chapter where I just really speak differently on the subject. It's not that it's wrong, but yeah, it's sort of frozen in time, and I would like to update it. That's the nature of putting anything into form. Yeah. So, but I think there's so much of what I've written about that is so primordial in a way that it's timeless. And if I have a second go at it, I think I'll feel great about having that be the thing that's left in the world when I'm gone.
Well, I mean, you hit on something that when we talked before, I sometimes stick my foot in my mouth without meaning to, and I still remember saying, I really liked your book. There wasn't necessarily anything really new. And then afterwards I said, oh God, I didn't mean it in that way.
But I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah.
Right. But what I was intending to get to after taking my foot out of my mouth was, but it was compiled in such a great way. And yes, it was written in 2000, or it was written before 2007, published in 2007.
Some of it was written 25 years ago. And
it wasn't, so also a lot of it was new at the time, was that. But regardless of whether it was an original idea or not, it was put together in just a really great way. And I remember thinking, I was just somewhere recently and someone was talking about osteopathy. I was in a training 2 weeks ago, and someone was talking about osteopathy, and they clearly didn't know very much about it. And I remember wanting to just to say to them, hey, go read Bonnie's book and go listen to the podcast, because you have such little information that you're taking to be this wide picture, because whatever reason, there's information out there that helps compile it a lot better, so you have access to more of it, and that's really helpful.
Yeah, because there are many. It's no different in osteopathy than in any field. There are people who represent the work really differently. And you can meet one person and have a total misconception about what the rest of the field is like. So there's no solution to that. I mean, that's just part of being human. We're a funny bunch of very varied people who all filter things through our own perceptual field, and that gives a lot of variety. So there is no one way.
There isn't. I've had the joy of working and studying and getting treatments from French osteopaths, German osteopaths, Swiss osteopaths, British osteopaths, American, Canadian, Spanish. I think that's it. And there are definitely differences between the branches around there. some of the Eastern European, or sorry, Western European are more similar, but there still is like very differences.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about osteopathy is that the founder of the profession did not write a book of techniques.
Mm-hmm.
And he purposely said, I everyone needs to write their own textbook.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to learn anatomy, physiology, and the principles of osteopathy. And then people practice really differently because everybody applies the principles in their own way. They don't always come out quite the same. And he felt strongly enough about the principles that he was willing to risk, not codifying them more than he did, and really relying on the oral tradition to have them passed down and have people evolve their own technique from their own experience. Mm-hmm. So that's why there's a lot of variety out there and perhaps misconception. It also becomes a game of telephone, if you just whisper in someone's ear down the line, what comes out at the end is usually nothing like the way it began at the beginning. Yeah. So I think historically we've gone through a bit of that game of distortion over time.
Yeah. There's a joke. It's a little different with osteopathy, but there's a joke in the rolfing world that there are as many ways to rolf as there are rolfers.
Right. Yeah. Same spirit.
Well, you and I believe, could talk for hours, as we've already said. Right. I want to honor your time. B, I've got a client coming in soon, but also just thinking about the container of the episode and how much information is already out there. For me, it feels like both my inside say, no, I want more time. She's so great. I want all this information. But my more meditative state is saying this feels like a good place for stopping for today. But I want to hear your sense of that.
I feel like I did my best to encapsulate a few philosophical nuggets. And I agree, we could sit and talk for hours, and I hope we someday have a chance to do that. But in the meantime, with the limits of the material world, we do have to stop. So I'm happy to call this our pausing point.
Yeah, I like your the truth of it is this is these we've just really opened and scratched surfaces of so many wider areas, which is also why I want people to take your class, and I want them to read your book. I want them to listen to your podcast, because that's all we're doing is opening doors here for what can come. And there is so much, there's just so much in there that you and I both know, and we're limited by constraints. So I appreciate you naming that. How would you want people to find you?
They can go to my website. They can contact me through the contact page on my website. That's probably the easiest. That way they don't have to remember anything other than my name.
Well, that's what I was hoping that I'd have you say. They can find me on my website. It's bonniegintis.com.
If people go to bonniegintis.com,
thank you.
They can find a link to the podcast. They can find a link to my teaching schedule. Right now, I'm not teaching anything online, so there'll be 2 classes listed in person. Both of them are happening at Kripalu. The more general of the 2 classes is called Embodiment Through the Senses, and it's this coming October 27th through November 1st. And if people have questions, they can contact me through the contact page on my website, or if they have questions about Kripalu, there's a link on my website to Kripalu's page. Perfect. In the spring, I also teach a class that's more oriented towards people who I say have been touched by cancer. And you don't have to have cancer to come to the workshop, but if you have someone in your life who's dealing with cancer and you would like to explore having a new relationship with living with something as challenging as cancer, I invite people to that. And it's Continuum, it's osteopathy, but it's very oriented towards people dealing with cancer in their life. And all of that can be found through my website.
Super.
Yeah.
Well, Thank you for that. And
as well as links to buy my book in English or Italian. um, my book didn't get translated into German because so many Germans speak English so well. The publisher felt like it was it wasn't worthwhile doing. And I've sold more books in Germany than England, which always I find interesting. So
yeah, it is a bit interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is hopefully a to be continued.
Okay.
But for now, I want to just again say thank you for your time and for everything.
And I want to thank you for your curiosity and for welcoming me. It's been a delight.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks for listening to us at Touching into Presence. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can find out more about Bonnie at bonniegintis.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast and subscribe to it through the platform of your choice. When you do this, it really helps other people find us, and we greatly appreciate your support. We look forward to hearing back from you and seeing you on our next conversation at Touching into Presence. Bye for now.